Well, hello. This is a special project from the History Symposium. First off, I would like to invite my guests to introduce themselves, maybe starting with yourself, David. And maybe you can explain who you are and why you can talk to us about things that go boom or field artillery. So,
Excellent. Well, hey Tom, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. My name's Dave Grebstad. I'm a serving Army officer in the Canadian Army, and I've been serving now for almost 35 years. It'll be 35 years in November, but specifically as it pertains to here, I'm an artillery officer. So I've been making things go boom for, well, near to 35 years. Of course, I'm a staff officer now, so I haven't heard a boom in a very, very long time,
yeah.
except when I kick the photocopier because it's not working well. That's about the only booms I get to hear these days. But no, I have been an artillery officer. I've served in the Royal Regiment Canadian Artillery for quite a while. I'm a qualified instructor in gunnery, having taken the technically demanding instructor in gunnery course at the Royal Canadian Artillery School several years ago. Served a number of years as an instructor at the artillery school. And I'm also a big history buff, which brings me here. And I've written a number of articles on a variety of subjects, but not a few of them are about the artillery. And that's not just articles, but also one book, which is Iron Indignation, which is the it's about the evolution of artillery tactics during the First World War that led up to the Canadian Corps' victory at Vimy Ridge. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm a big history buff and really looking forward to the opportunity to tell the story of the guns from my perspective.
Well, and you're a friend of the channel. I think this is the third time you have joined us now, and we
That's
always
right. Yeah,
appreciate
I
your
get a
support.
I get a set of steak knives on the fourth one. I heard. Yeah,
Or maybe the next time I'm through Ottawa, I can buy you a beer or something along the way. So, or come to
okay.
Chrysler's Farm next year. We can let you fire one of our guns. So, yeah,
There you go. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
All right. And then Marty, how about introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Martin Land. I go by Marty. I do not have the same kind of pedigree that David has, but the I predominantly come through it again as a history geek, uh, volunteering at Fort Meigs for the last going on nearly 30 years now, so about the same amount of duration. And of course, Fort Meigs is an artillery fort. It's all about artillery. So I've kind of come up through the ranks, made the um, done a lot of studying of a lot of different artillery styles from I would say the first quarter of the 1800s and the 1700s, and going back to kind of learn the history. Um, American artillery of the period is not well known or understood. It's very much a work in progress. So, but that's me. I am retired now, but I was a professional trainer, not physical trainer, instructional trainer for about 35 years in the utility industry.
All right. And I'd like to say, Marty, you're a good friend of mine. We've known each other 20 plus years and
Yes.
have shot at each other, but also when the lights go down and the public goes away, then we've managed to socialize and further develop our friendship. So, uh, kind of had a thought. We at the History Symposium got a suggestion from YouTube, maybe their AI blend in that said, based on your content and the content that people are consuming, it might be a neat idea if you could explore the use of artillery through different eras. And that's why I approached both of you. I thought you guys were uniquely positioned to support that talk. So everyone has a perspective. We have a number of pictures that both David and Martin provided. I think we'll look at some of those, talk about them. I think they'll each react to photos the other has, and I think it's just going to be fun watching these guys kind of mash up each other's photos and learn more around the different time periods. So roughly, we're going to cover War of 1812 slash Napoleonic era through to World War One. So I thought I'll begin by starting the slideshow, and then we might intermittently go back to this sort of view and then show slides again. Will depend, I guess, how long a conversation is, but I think the slides are serve a good purpose in illustrating what we're talking about. So bear with me 1 second. All right, I believe we have this here. So, Marty, you're going to be up first. Here's a dramatic photo I added to your deck. Maybe you can describe this photo, and then we'll start going through your slides.
Um, any of your audience that is our reenactors will instantly recognize this as Fort Erie a few years ago. Now, uh, of course, a lot of my photos are modern photos because no one was taking pictures in 1810, 1812, et cetera, until about 1860. So this is actually a field gun, a 6-pounder in action at Fort Erie. Um, there's infantry in the background, and I don't know if I have a lot to say about this other than I use photos like this in training quite often because I'm trying to emphasize, especially with the infantry, that it is not, even though we're firing a blank charge at about half of the service weight, that is not a safe place to be in front of the muzzle of that gun.
Well, and I'm much the same. Whether it's I reenact on the British side for those of us that don't know us as reenactors. So I'm with the Crown Forces doing War of 1812. So whether it's my own artillery behind me or the artillery we're facing, we're very conscious of the cone in front of a gun, not just from the percussion or sound, but as you can see, the flames and explosive gases coming out of the muzzle of that gun right there. So it's something we take very seriously, even though we're pretending or recreating playing with black powder. It's a highly explosive substance, and there's a high degree of risk associated with it, and that's why we spend a lot of time training and then also implementing safety protocols.
Actually, sorry, Tom. Can
Yeah.
I jump in real quick? Just because I think, can you go to yeah, back to that photo? I just one thing that I kind of want to plant a seed, and then we're gonna cycle back when I'm chatting a little bit later. But I think this is a great photo, and what you two gents really hit on, like the amount of force that is coming out of the barrel, and like this being a reenactment, there's no actual projectile. It's not quite the full service charge. And I think what a lot of people who you can't tell from this photo, and maybe people who watch reenactment maybe not may not see, is that the force coming out of guns in this era, leading right up until the to the U.S. Civil War, would cause those guns to recoil. The whole gun would roll backwards, and the gunners would have to push the gun back into position, back into battery, they might call it, back into the position. It was very, very laborious, and it would also slow down the rate of fire. And I want to just plant that seed because when we talk about the back half of the 19th century, we're going to see how a major technological evolution that eliminated that, and it was one of the very first revolutions in American in military affairs that totally was a game changer on the battlefield. So sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. That's kind of what I hoped we'd have is that we have conversations around these things. And then Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, like if a gun's in place for a period of time, that then not only you get the recoil, but you get degradation of the ground, right? So like with a siege, they would actually build a gun platform to help preserve the position longer.
Yes, and to aid in aiming, believe it or not. So there would be you would set up a deck, makes the gun easier to work. It does increase the recoil. It was going to go into the recoil. You see the two gentlemen standing between the wheel and the barrel of the gun. Okay, in the field, the gun will, of course, roll away from them. They will remain stationary, and they're the markers. So the rest of the gun crew rolls the gun back up to those two gentlemen. Right? Think about it. That's their job. Part of their job is they're stationed in such a way the backs of their legs are against the axles or the axle. So to respot the gun quickly, you would just bring it back to those two gentlemen who ideally don't flinch much. And I've been in a position once where a gun did recoil away from me, and it was surprising because you don't see that much in reenacting world. But these guns can recoil anywhere from 4 to 6 feet back. That's how
Wow.
far it would roll back with a service charge and a projectile. Which is why the man firing has a long stick, so he doesn't break his arm when the gun rolls past him.
Yeah, and I'll point out, and maybe I'll link to it at the end of the video. We have another good video of a Royal Artillery Group Battle Axe Company taking us through all the steps involved with the proper way to prepare the gun for firing, loading it, firing it, and then what you have to do to prepare for the next round. So that way we don't spend too much time on that here. And what do we have here, Marty? Here's another.
Okay, so this I threw this in because this is a a gun gin, essentially. It's called a gin. It's meant to be portable. It has spikes on its feet. When we set this up on our battery at Fort Meigs, we had to drill holes in the deck to allow the spikes to drive through. But ideally, it would be set up on ground. And this is really a magical device. We use it to teach people about mechanical advantage. So you see, it's not just a barrel that you wind the rope onto. So the smaller diameter to the right, and the larger diameter to the left. When you're raising a weight, you work the windlass in such a way that it winds onto the bigger diameter rope, and of course, the bigger diameter drum, which overall shortens the length, which raises the barrel. What's neat about it is because it's wound backwards on the shorter one, on the smaller diameter, is that it's self-suspending. So you don't have, once you raise that barrel that's on there is about a 900-pound barrel, we can raise that barrel up to about chest high and then just take the poles out and it will just hang there. We don't, for obvious reasons, in case some public member comes along and starts monkeying with it and drops the darn thing. But yeah, it will suspend that barrel any weight up to 1,500 pounds or 2,000 pounds easily. Will suspend in just, you raise it to a height and it just hangs there because it's counterbalanced.
And then why would you want to lift a barrel?
You lift a barrel, well, you can see in the background there, there's a Garrison carriage with a 12-pounder on it. So the barrels, frequently when you're traveling, you're either moving them by ship or barge, but they're not mounted onto their, not necessarily mounted onto their carriages. And so you would need to mount them onto the carriage, or in some cases, like at Fort Meigs, build the carriage on site first and then mount the barrels onto the carriage. So that's why you need the gin. That's why you need a gin. And of course, you can't see in this picture, there's a leg that sticks straight out on the back side. The idea is you can knock this thing down and pack it in the back of a wagon and use it to set up your positions. Gun barrels, of course, can be very heavy. That's a 6-pounder, a short 6-pounder, light 6-pounder. And that, as I said, iron weighs about 900, in the neighborhood of 900 pounds for the barrel.
Yeah, I was at Fort Malden on the weekend and looking at some of the guns they had at on site there, and it some 24 pounders and what monstrous beasts those things are. It's something else. All right. I kind of recognize this from some of my European travel. What do we have here, Marty?
So again, in the American artillery in their first quarter is modeled on the Gribeval artillery system in use in France. So this is actually a ammunition wagon. With a peaked roof, it's to kind of shed water. There was a lot of these. You would have typically 1.5 to 2 of them per gun. So there's a lot of these things around. You don't really ride on. This one is kind of neat because it's got a toolbox on the front. But this is in the L'Invalades Museum in Paris. So this is an actual surviving artillery wagon from the time of Napoleon. Um, and then the next one is our reproduction of that type of wagon. Now we've got 3 of these boxes that have survived in the American in the American world. Actually, not so much. One at Fort Niagara, one at Fort George, as it happens. And this one is actually the size of the one at Fort George. The box is, and it has a domed roof covered with canvas rather than a peaked roof, and the no toolbox on the front, as far as we know. And of course, we don't have the undercarriage, so we just made a generic undercarriage. But this is a reproduction again at Fort Meigs. This travels around with us there as part of our field artillery train.
Now, this would be specific to one gun, or it would support a single gun.
So the yes, there would be, as I said, you'd like to. One of the manuals, the Stoddard's manual, calls for 2 of these wagons for each gun. But these wagons are not just used for ammunition; they're used for infantry ammunition. They're used for tools. They're used for everything. So they're around. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and there's lots of them. Which is something you don't normally think of. You think of maybe a Conestoga type wagon as the transport, but there's lots of these wagons around. And it turns out that the boxes themselves make pretty good storage for grain and things. And so after the war, farmers would snaffle these things up and put them in their barns as storage boxes. And so that's why I said I know of 4 of these boxes that have survived. This photo was taken right after we first rolled it out. But the original that this is based on is stenciled US 6-pounder number 2. So you know what it goes to.
All right. So then loading the gun, you have the black powder and then a variety of different ordnance it can fire. Is the black powder pre-measured? Like, is it in canvas bags? And is there different sizes of bags, or is it one sort of common weight?
Well, the answer, of course, is yes. There's in fact, I think is a shot image next up.
Yeah.
For field artillery, you preferred to have what was called fixed ammunition. So the powder would be shipped out to the frontier in barrels, but then the soldiers would make up cartridges, and they called them cartridge. And each of the types of ordnance, so the one on the right is a case shot, and if you look at the base set, there's a wooden base, and you see 2 little grooves in there. So they'd make up a bag for a 6-pounder. A case shot is going to be about 2 pounds of black powder. So they'd put it. They have it's a tight weave linen bag that's used so it doesn't leak too much. But 2 pounds of black powder, and the top of the bag is a drawstring, and the drawstring goes in those grooves. And then the whole thing would be packaged in another bag, so that it was actually one thing, fixed ammunition. So powder and projectile together in one thing. Same thing with a solid shot in the middle there. The round cannonball in the middle would be sitting on a wooden base with a similar groove arrangement on it. And the idea was to speed the loading. So you're not loading the shot separate from the powder. If you went to bigger calibers, so on the left there is a common shell that doesn't have any grooves on the base, on the sabot. That's because by that point you've gotten something that's heavy enough that you can't, one package with the propellant and the projectile together is too heavy to manipulate easily. And so you'd have a separate propellant bag that you would load in the gun, ram it down, and then load the projectile on top of it. And that typically goes, anything bigger than 18 to 24 pounder guns tended to have separate powder and projectile smaller guns, field artillery, the 4s and the 6s and the 9s tended to do fixed ammunition because it aided in the rate of fire.
Okay.
And as long as we're here, the one in the back is a grape shot. That's actually from an 1860 version of grape American Civil War version of grape shot. You see the balls there are pretty big. The case shot balls are like half an inch in
They're more like
and there's
musket
maybe 40
balls.
or 50 of them. They're like musket balls. Only important distinguish, and the manuals of the time talk about it quite a bit. They need to be made of iron and not lead. So it's not musket balls. It's not lead balls. The problem with lead balls is that the firing them out of the gun tended to melt them together, and you lost the effect, the pellet effect that you were going for.
Huh, never heard that before.
So they
Cool.
insist that they be iron balls and not lead balls.
Okay.
Again, Tom, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see a little later on how this type of munition, specifically something that would spray those balls, um, evolved to the point of what would eventually become the shrapnels now. So even before this, the shrapnel spherical case shot, it was called, was created, but we'll see later how it was built into a like the bullet shape that we now know, and the very same concept in that the small ball bearings or musket balls or what have you, the grapes. They are excellent anti-personnel weapons, and they do in many cases more damage than any sort of solid shot. So it's just an evolution from that basic premise all the way to just making it the delivering of it to be a little bit more effective.
Okay. Yeah. And in Napoleonic era, if it's a line, a column advancing, then and you're using artillery on the infantry, then the sequence was solid shot from a distance, and then grape shot, and then at the closest distance, and they'd start using canister for the ultimate effect.
So I'm gonna give you a little correction there. I think that's what we've always said. I
Yeah.
don't think that's necessarily true. Grape shot, I would rather we didn't even talk about grape shot. Grape
Okay.
shot is more of a naval thing. So the problem is how much stuff do you want to lug around? Because remember, everything you're carrying, there is horse transport, but they're very conscious of weight, of how much weight goes into a wagon, how many horses do I have, what's the health condition of my prime movers, my horses. And so they tended to not carry a field battery that's moving on the field, will only carry the ordnance that they feel they're likely to use, which for cannon, for how 6-pounders, for example, it's typically going to be 2/3 of their total loadout is going to be a solid cannon, solid shot, and 1/3 is going to be case shot. They're not even going to bring grape shot at all, and they will only bring shell for if they have howitzers available, which we talked about later.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
yeah. So now what's interesting is that if you read first person accounts, a lot of times the people receiving the fire will say they were being shot at with grape. But that's just kind of I don't know how they're measuring the size of these things as they fly past them. But I strongly suspect that grape is a generic in those first person accounts is more of a generic term for something that is not solid shot. So I
All
can
right.
tell the difference between solid shot and smaller stuff, but I really can't tell the difference between what I'm getting shot at with. So I think they just use grape as a generic term. Yeah. Now the last thing I said, carriages and things were built on site or travel. So you need basically your own traveling shop to set up. This is our traveling forge. This is our blacksmith's forge. The only thing I don't want to get into blacksmiths too much, but just the thing to be aware of is that all the equipment is very similar. So the front end of this forge is actually a gun limber, a field artillery limber. So you can pull that, you can see the pintle sticking up, you can pull that front end right off and use it as an artillery limber. the wheels on the forge and the wheels on the wagon and the wheels on all the field guns are all the same size. They're all interchangeable. This was Grabovall's great invention is to standardize the size of things. So essentially, you have two sizes of wheels, and to the extent practicable, everything is pretty much interchangeable. He has bigger wheels for heavier guns, of course.
Interesting. All right. And so in a pinch or an emergency, then they had spares readily available. So
Yeah, we don't have the ammunition wagon properly should have a another pentel sticking off the back with a wheel on it. Um,
and we'll see that I think in a Civil War image upcoming.
we
So
will see that in images. When we were making our reproductions, we chose not to do that for logistical purposes. It makes it difficult to load it on a wagon, and it's
practical
loaded on a
considerations,
trailer.
right?
Yeah, it presents its own set of challenges.
All right. We have another firing image here.
All right. The first image was of course a gun, a 6-pounder field gun. These are howitzers. These are 5.5 inch howitzers. They would be firing the common shell that we talked about earlier. You'll see the barrels are much shorter. The drill is basically the same. The big significant difference is you no longer have your gunner, your matrosses, your servicemen standing up in the front because the barrel's so short. So they're actually moved as part of the drill. So you see the backs of the people closest to you. Those are the number one, number two matrosses that have come back before the guns are fired.
And then they're elevated a lot more than a regular
Correct.
gun, right? So okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I gotta say, you guys had me fire the one howitzer at Fort Meigs the one time, and it's kind of an unnerving experience seating the charge in that little cup on the bottom, like putting your arm in up to your shoulder, and
Yes, you do. Yeah, there's the trick with these howitzers in our time in early 1800s is that it needs a reduced powder charge because you're not firing a solid projectile, you're firing a hollow ball essentially. And if you did a full service charge or a full charge like you would have for a 24-pounder gun, which is what a 5.5 inch bore is, you would break the shell. You would the shell would be damaged by the propellant charge, and that's not what we want. We want the shell to be intact all the way down range, and so you need a much smaller propellant charge, and that means you need a small chamber in the back of the piece, in the breech, that is your propellant charge. So the propellant charge is about the size of a large baked potato, and you take to load it, you take that and you reach in because the barrel's only about 2 feet long, and you place it in the chamber in the back of the gun. Ram
All
that
right,
down, and then you would load the projectile on top of it.
all right, you might have another opportunity to correct me, but then the shell has a fuse in it, so the act of firing it ignites the fuse, and then it's cut to a length that I guess determines when it's going to burst.
Yes,
I got that
although
right.
timing is a little trickier.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's and it's not the kind of fuse you might think of like the old Rocky and Bullwinkler cartoons with the fuse out the top. But it is a wooden plug essentially that is inserted into the shell, and that plug is drilled most of the way down and then packed with a mealed gunpowder mixture. And gunpowder only burns where there's space around it, so just the surface will burn. And then to set it, you actually cut a notch in this wooden plug. They're marked off in half-second increments, and you had a little saw or sometimes a punch that you used to punch a hole or cut a notch on the right increment mark. And the idea was when it burned down to that point, fire would then come out of the wooden plug and into the body of the shell where your bursting charge was.
Okay.
And it actually worked more or less most of the time, which is amazing.
All right. You were saying during our pre-work that this was a scene from Gettysburg, so we moved on to Civil War era. Has the technology changed a whole lot from War of 1812 through to the U.S. Civil War?
The gun barrels would be perfectly recognizable by a gunner from the War of 1812, from 1800. An artilleryman from 1800 would look at that and know exactly what it is. Um, the difference is, again, I'm talking American Army. The British Army is already transitioning to what's called a block trail carriage. You see, it's a single piece that comes back. It enables you to turn the gun tighter when it's on its limber. So it's makes it more maneuverable. Uh, Although it's more vulnerable to damage, it's harder to repair in the field. Um, yeah, this is a pair of I'm not sure what these are. Uh, Probably 3-inch ordnance rifles at Gettysburg, lined up on. I think that's the wheat field down there, but I could be wrong.
All
But
right.
you'll see it's a single block. Yeah,
Oh,
this I.
I think we wanted this one just in advance, but okay.
Well, that one, yeah. So that carried. This is a 1750 French gun, field gun. It's in the museum, in the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh. And what I wanted to point out here is that you remember in the first photo we saw the not just flames out of the barrel, but also out of the vent. So every time you fire a gun, you wear it. And this particular gun has been worn to pieces. Normally, this would be much smaller hole there. I put my uh, pinky finger in there so you get the feel that I could shove my pinky finger all the way down that hole. That's the vent, and it is worn out. There is a field repair you can do where you basically bore that out and insert a plug in. But I just put that in because you don't often see worn out gun barrels.
Well, and then I think it speaks to the amount of time these guns were used, right?
Oh
There was
yes.
there was talk of American Revolutionary era guns captured at some of the War of 1812 battles. Like they were in the field a very long time.
Yeah, there's no reason you can't keep using these as long as I said, the loading process isn't really any different. Uh, these things last forever. And I said this is from 1756, but you can have similar barrels from as early as 1720 that are still in use 100 years later.
All right, and then what's that thing that looks like a toothpick at the bottom of it?
Oh, so that's a little notch. That's a sighting aid. So you have to forgive me. I've forgotten the French name for that. But you will see that on various original guns. Uh, Sometimes on the base ring, there would be a corresponding notch like that on the swell of the muzzle. The muzzle flares out. And it's a sighting aid. The idea is you could look along that. Um, the the problem with those built-in aids, sometimes they're on the side of the base ring instead of the top, is that it's if the gun itself is not on a level platform, then the notch will not be on necessarily on the top of the barrel, and you want to sight along the exact top of the barrel. So in many of the contemporary artillery manuals, they dispense with the notch, and in the French service the notch comes and then it goes away and then it comes back, and it's just a filed mark on the base ring.
All right, and let's get back to Civil War era. I think we mentioned these a moment ago. So these are limber ammunition wagons, but with a spare wheel on them.
Yeah, so this takes the place of that ammunition wagon that we saw earlier. It's again, this is an 1863, 1864 time period. You see the spare wheels on the back. You see the double. By this point, all the ammunition is stored on a chest that is kept on the limber in the earlier 1800s. The box was much smaller. The ready ammunition box was much smaller and actually rode on the gun, and then was transferred to the limber when the gun was unlimbered. But the front half of this is a regular gun limber, and the back half is a kind of double limber box ammunition wagon spot. And the gunners would ride on these. You see the little handholds and the footboards and things. And again, this is a Gettysburg picture for those of you that are Gettysburg fans.
Okay. And then here's a busy image.
Yeah, so according to the manuals I have, the Toussard wrote in 1803, and in one of his books, or in his book, he talks about a field battery of 6 guns requires 140 horses. And then, of course, the support for those horses, you have to have a farrier, a smith to shoe them, somebody to take care of them and feed them and everything else. This is, again, a Civil War field battery, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guns. So this is a standard field battery. Just in there to give you the feel for the amount of space and the amount of livestock required to move 6 guns.
Wow. And here's another image showing much the same thing, right?
Yep, except that in this case, the guns are not on their limbers; they're in battery.
It looks like, and there's 4 guns in this one.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see 5. I think there's one way down at the end, but there might be one. Actually, there's probably one underneath our little thumbnails there too, all the way on the right. I can't tell. 6 is kind of a common number. Some Napoleonic batteries had 8 guns. Were authorized 8 guns. 6 is a very common authorized strength. In actual service, it might be much less than that. The other thing, of course, is they wanted them to all be the same caliber, but in actual service, that wasn't necessarily the true. I know Towson's battery at Lundy's Lane had a 6-pounder and 2 12s. Not Lundy's Lane, Chippewa.
Okay, that's quite large guns.
Yeah, 2 field 12-pounders. Yeah.
Okay. All right. At this point, we're going to transition to David, who's been patiently waiting in the wings. So, David.
Hey, that's great. Thanks very much. Very, very interesting, Marty. I appreciate that. So, it's funny as I watch that, and when we go through the photos of everything that's going to lead us up until about 1917, seeing how much had changed, but then, as we'll see in some photos, how much hadn't changed. So there was a incredible increase in technological advance, especially when it came to the gun themselves, I believe, and the projectiles. But it's funny, look at those last photos of the guns and their limbers with their teams and the gunners. And when you see the photos of the 18-pounders that we're going to look at in the First World War, how that's almost exactly the same. So it's quite fascinating. So what we're looking at here, and I apologize, I didn't do enough research. It's one of Krupp's field guns, and the key thing here is that I've got a great book here that I recommend to everybody, Bruce Gudmundson's On Artillery, and I'll just share real quick one very brief quote from it saying, "The artillery of Europe entered the 20th century under the shadow of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. And when we think of what the artillery was in the Great War, it may not seem to be very intuitive, but essentially that all began with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. So what you see here is one of the Krupp guns. And when France and the Prussians went to war in 1870, France went into it with great elan and with great expectations. But if you're a student of that war, it didn't work out well for them very, very well at all. And the victory of the Prussians when it came to artillery was so vast that it really spurned a change in France. They launched immediately thereafter a search for how they would never lose the battlefield advantage in gunnery. At least that was their theory. Again, after that, and one of the main reasons is what you see here with the Krupp gun is its breech loading. So it significantly sped up the rate of fire of the gun. So that was only one of their improvements, but there was also a number of other improvements with range and various other things. So starting in, and believe it or not, Krupp started developing these in the 1850s, and the breech loading, like sliding breech, was created in the 60s, but it wasn't until the 70s that it really came into force. So that was one of the very first revolutions in military affairs that changed things substantially. Whereas during the Franco-Prussian War, the French were still using muzzle loaders, and they just could not maintain the same rate of fire that the Germans or the Prussians could during that time. I guess they would eventually be Germans, so I guess we could say Germans. And it was because of that breech loading mechanism and their ability to reload that much fire. But what I want to focus in on here and highlight to everybody is there's the recoil is still the gun sliding backwards, and that's how the force of the shock of the firing was dissipated by simply the gun moving back. So they still had to push this up to battery, but that breech mechanism changed things substantially. So if we go to the next slide. So what you see here is a fanciful depiction of the French 75, the French 75 millimeter field gun, which revolutionized the artillery leading up into the First World War. And they took the lessons learned from Prussia and they applied it. And by 1897, it took them a while, they created the very first gun that had a recoil mechanism on it. And that's what this Prussian gun has here. This French gun has here. And you can't see because I chose the wrong photo because the chap right in front of it is standing right in front of the breech. But essentially what the French 75 had was a hydropneumatic device that when the gun fired, the barrel would slide back. And I won't go into too much detail, but there's essentially a floating piston in the recoil mechanism that as the barrel slid backwards, it went forward and compressed a kind of inert or a kind of fluid within the recoil system. And then once it got compressed, it would push back and it would reverse the whole process and it would slam the barrel back into position. And the good news with this was the gun wouldn't roll back. So when you combine the effect of a breech loading mechanism, and I apologize for my dog that's going crazy behind me here. Hopefully you can't hear it.
Can't hear it that much.
Okay, good. But the barrel would slide back and slide back into what they call a battery position. You could open the breech and reload it. So the combination of breech loading and the recoil mechanism was totally revolutionized the war. And not just for the French, revolutionized artillery, but in the British military, which is what I'm really going to focus on from here on out. They experienced the same because, believe it or not, right around the time that the French 75 was coming in, and they were fighting in the Boer War, the Boers were actually all armed with German guns, like the Krupp guns, and specifically the Krupp 73, which was an improvement after the Prussian War. So the British, believe it or not, were actually outgunned during the South African Boer War, and it led to a complete rearming of the British, not complete, but a very large rearming of the British artillery during the First World War. And they chose to take the recoil science of the French 75 and apply it to what we'll see as their 18-pounder. And nobody ever looked back. Interesting little tidbit, though. The patent for the recoil system was actually designed by a German, but the Germans didn't pick up on it, and the patent protection didn't exist in France. So the French just kind of stole his design and ended up with the recoil system, and the 75 is what came of it. Excuse me for 1 second. Hey, what are you doing? Stop. So obviously she needs attention. So
Yeah, or she's not a fan of artillery. So
yeah, exactly. And
Oh,
she was sleeping very peacefully right up until it was my turn to talk. Okay, next slide, please. So there you have the British 18 pounder, and here you can see the recoil system on top. So that cylinder that's on top of the barrel is the recoil system, and you can see the breech operating device there. And they were using Marty already kind of touched on this fixed ammunition. So essentially, the 18 pounder bullet or projectile would come already made. And so what all the soldier had to do, as you can see there, is he pick it up, slam it in there, close the breech, fire. And that's what made it a quick firing gun. So this was all part of the quick firing revolution, the breech loading mechanism, the fixed ammunition, and the recoil system. That can all be encompassed in what was known towards the end of the 19th century as the quick firing revolution. And that revolutionized, as the name implied, the rate of fire and how artillery was used. But as you can see here, I'll talk a little bit about tactics now. Direct fire was still de rigueur. Even though throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, indirect fire was known, it was looked down upon. And in fact, in the Royal Artillery, the British artillery, it was scorned because a gentleman would never fight a war in such a manner where they would hide behind trees or on the other side of hills and fire indirectly. So leading right up into the First World War, the tactic was very similar to, I think, what Marty would know from the Napoleonic and even the Civil War, in that you would gallop up, unlimber your guns, fire over direct sights, win the artillery duel against your fellow gunners across the side. And then once you've done that, turn your sights onto the enemy infantry and create a hole in the enemy infantry lines for your infantry to pass through. But those tactics did not survive the conflict on the first or on the Western Front. But that's essentially how, when the war started in August of 1914. In fact, the anniversary of the start of the war was just yesterday. So when the war started in August of 1914, up until October, that's how it was fought. Can you just go to the next slide? I can't remember what the next slide was. Let's see if it's something I want to talk about. Okay, we'll go back to that.
all right,
So
as we go back, a
yeah,
question, David. So
sure.
you've substantially increased rate of fire with the recoil system, breech loading. Did
Mhm.
that put more strain on the gun? Did they reach times when it was overheated and they'd have to time out to allow it to recover, or how did all
They
that work?
They did for sure. Guns would overheat all the time, and as Marty was talking about, guns will wear down. So now I'm not sure what terminology they used, in 1914, but we now keep gun record books that measure what we call EFCs, which stands for equivalent full charge. So if you were firing a howitzer, and in modern howitzers, which have separate ammunition, and you have a casing with up to 7 charge bags, you can take two out or whatever. You calculate that. So a charge 5 would be, a 0.7 of an equivalent full charge, or something like that. And as you fire, not only does the explosion kind of wear away the metal, but of course the metal on metal, as the round is traveling down the barrel, it literally scrapes the barrels out. And it's a great question, because I was going to skip over this accidentally, but we also see now the use of rifled barrels. So whereas in the Napoleonic times, and even leading up to the 1860s, they were smooth barrels where projectiles were pushed down and they were fired. Once, just like a rifle, a handheld rifle, once you impart spin on a artillery projectile, it becomes more stable and you get further range. But the problem, that one of the downsides to that is, literally, as the projectile goes down the barrel, it turns against that and it wears away at the lands and grooves that form the rifling, and the leading edge of the land, or of the groove, pardon me, gets worn away more, and you end up with these microscopic little holes all around the gun, not holes, but like gaps, and the gas will actually pass through that. A lot of people don't know, but depending on the caliber of the gun and the charge you're firing, but let's just take your average 105 millimeter howitzer. when the charge is ignited to push the projectile out, there's about 5,000, depending on the caliber and the number of charges, about 5,000 atmospheres worth of pressure that is behind that projectile, which is pushing it down the barrel. So the gas, believe it or not, is actually expanding faster than the bullet is traveling down the barrel. So consequently, if you any of those little gaps means that you do not achieve full obturation. Obturation is a fancy word. It's a scientific word just meaning you're sealing the gases in behind something. And any of those little cracks or crevices, the gas will actually, because it's moving faster, will actually go through that crack and crevice, and you lose muzzle velocity. You lose the actual push on it. So eventually, the guns will slow down and they'll lose range and they won't be as accurate. So you're absolutely right. It was a long way of saying yes. With heavy intensive firing, eventually barrels will either have to be replaced or relined or something. But you'll get to the point where the gun just can't be trusted, especially if you're firing very close to friendly troops, because it's what we call a probable error in range, kind of the beaten zone that it would fire on increases as it gets we'll call it a little loose. And I don't know for sure, but I think that's where the term loose cannons comes from. Perhaps I don't know if that's actually the case.
All right.
But yeah, that's a little science lesson for what obturation means and the importance of having that full obturation for having not just the best muzzle velocity that you can get out of a gun like this, but also a steady muzzle velocity that results in very predictable ranges. And just an interesting aside that if you ever watch a extreme slow motion video of a bullet emerging from the end of a howitzer, as it comes out of the howitzer and obturation ceases because what we call the driving band actually passes beyond the barrel. It'll actually look momentarily like the bullet is flying backwards because the gas, as I said, is expanding faster than the bullet, so it actually travels around the bullet. It's fascinating to see all this gas is actually going around the bullet and actually imparts a little extra push on it as it travels around the bullet and gives a little extra oomph. So the highest muzzle velocity of a projectile as it leaves a barrel is actually 2 to 3 caliber lengths beyond the muzzle of the actual barrel.
Wow.
So pretty fascinating stuff. Anyway, that's my geek point on that right there. That's 10 months of instructor and gunnery training at the school paying off, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so sorry, this is your 18 pounder, and I'll talk a little bit about tactics. So as I said at the start of the First World War, it was the tactics in general were very similar to what would have been used in the 1815 or in 1850s. But as the race to the sea ended, and essentially we ended up with trench warfare, which was essentially just one elongated siege operation from the North Sea to Switzerland. The guns had to displace rearward because they were just too open, and they had to protect themselves. So starting in about October 1914, indirect fire became the way of doing business, and guns were now firing from what they called covered positions, where they were either on the other side of a hill or other side of a wood line, and trying to stay out of direct line of sight of the enemy artillery. So whereas they were right up to the front by the time you hit 1917, they were usually anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 yards, maybe even further behind the actual front line, so that they could have some sort of cover. But also, as you can see, this is the kind of thing that they would do. They would dump ammunition, and you just have all these tons of ammunition lying there, and you'd just be firing away for hours at a time. And when we look towards the end of this, my segment here, when we look at a barrage map, you'll see why. Because essentially, it wasn't a very exciting job. It was just constant firing for hours at a time by the end of the war. Okay, so that's a gun. No, one thing here is that it doesn't elevate much more than what you see there, and it doesn't traverse left and right much more, very, very much. So these were, I guess, what we'll call a gun or a cannon. So a lot of times the terms howitzer, gun, cannon are used interchangeably, but they are actually different technically they're different things. So this, you could call this a gun or a cannon. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a howitzer here, and very, very different. Nowadays, almost all guns are howitzers just because you need that versatility. So a gun would fire at a much more shallower elevation. And as you saw there, it would use fixed ammunition. So there wasn't a lot you could do to adjust the point of impact. Because it was very shallow in its trajectory, it was very easy to be masked by intervening terrain or a hill or something like that. Whereas a howitzer, as you can see here, can fire very flat, but can also fire at high angle. When we say high angle, we mean anything beyond 45 degrees. And it also usually used either semi-fixed or separate ammunition, which means the projectile was there, and then the propellant would actually be, as Marty was saying, like a sack to put in there, or in some cases a casing with charges inside it that would mate, and then you would load it into the gun. So what you could produce from that is you could both not only alter the charge you're using and thus the muzzle velocity, but also the angle much more that you were firing. So you could achieve plunging fire. So howitzers became quite important for both sides, because when you were in like in trench warfare, if you needed some sort of plunging fire to try to get down into trenches or over top of a hill feature, then down sharply on the other side, trenches or later mortars would be able to achieve that for you. So that's what you see here, and here you see the recoil mechanisms on the underside of this particular howitzer.
All right, and we added just counterpoint.
Oh, that's right, I forgot. Yeah, just to compare things. Yeah, and the principle was there of a howitzer, but it just evolved a little bit to see what you see here.
Yeah, fascinating to see 100 years on. It was a lot of the use was replicated, the same concept. So,
and this is just I shared this picture because the other thing that you noticed by 1914 and by the turn of the century is field guns are now getting really, really big as well. So here we have a 6-inch gun. And it, as you can imagine, it was used to fire into depth and at like more important targets, or not just used to suppress, but anything where you would need a weight of fire to actually destroy something. Usually, the 6 inches, or what we'll see later, a 60-pounder, would be used for those really important missions where destruction is key. On that note, again, I'll just it's not so much technical geekery, but tactical geekery. But essentially, artillery does three things: it suppresses, it neutralizes, and it destroys. In order to do each one of those, there's different weapon systems that are better aligned for each one of those. And a lot of times we talk about the explosive capability of the artillery, but in reality, and as we see, especially in the First World War, this evolving in the First World War and a lot in the Second World War, suppression was far more important than destruction. And neutralization simply means it's suppression with a little bit more destruction mixed in. But to actually destroy something, especially like a hardened machine gun nest or a pillbox or something, would take so much ammunition and so long that you would need a large gun like this, and you would need lots of time. So when we talk especially about field artillery, especially those 18-pounders that we saw, suppression was far more what they were trying to achieve, not necessarily neutralization or destruction, although some of that did occur. And when we talk about barrages a little later, you'll see why those barrages were meant not necessarily to destroy, but to suppress the enemy and to allow the friendly infantry to close up with it. Next slide, please.
Can I interject something on that slide real quick that just struck me as I was looking at it? Tom, you asked me about platforms or battery platforms, and I'm looking at what this 6-inch gun is sitting on, or howitzer is sitting on, and it is that could easily have been right out of 1800 or even 1760. I mentioned that there's a board, that big timber across the front there.
Mhm.
The purpose of that is when you survey your platform, you lay that out so that that big timber is exactly, I don't want to say, at a 90-degree angle to the direction that you're most likely to fire. And the idea is that even at night in total darkness, you can roll your wheels up to be tight to that timber and know exactly which direction the barrel is pointing, because it's going to be at a 90-degree angle to that herder board. Just a comment, they would mark those out with chalk to determine the center line, and at least at Fort Meigs, they pre-sighted. So they selected targets and they test fired from their batteries and adjusted their herder boards so that they could put fire down on a specific point, even when they couldn't see it at night, for example, or when it's obscured by smoke.
Nice. Fascinating. And this is just I apologize. I can't remember if this is a 60 pounder or a 9-inch howitzer, but it just gives an idea once again of the scale and how things had to be loaded. A projectile that size is, I would say it's probably a 9-inch because it looks a little heavier than 60 pounds. But it would take, there wouldn't be much of a rate of fire on this, obviously, or if the rate of fire would be slow, as you can imagine, but it would be used for buildings or communication nodes or headquarters that were in depth, or what in the terminology of the day in the First World War, it was called the back country. So all the kind of headquarters and whatnot. So they would fire more in depth, whereas the other guns would be used to support the infantry more. And yeah, and this is what I kind of alluded to earlier. This is just like an 18 pounder. I think it's an 18 pounder on the move, but not wholly different. Maybe some slight changes from what we saw in the Civil War photos there. But you have your team of, in this case, or there should be 6. 18 pounders normally traveled with 6.
Yeah, there's 3 across there. And I think I see another head back there.
Oh, maybe, yeah. But anyway, like 3 teams of 2 would normally carry an 18 pounder. You can see the gunners riding on the limber there, yeah. I think these are Australians, if I remember correctly, and they're moving. But when it comes, like, notwithstanding the advances in technology of the gun itself, this is what I was alluding to. The actual movement of the gun didn't change a heck of a lot. Now, at this time, you started to get gun tractors, like trucks with early engines in the First World War, but they were mostly used for the very large guns, like the 6 inches and the 60 pounders, the 9 inches and whatnot, to move them into position. Whereas all the field guns were still used horses. It wasn't until the 30s that the Royal Artillery, then later the Royal Canadian Artillery, really mobilized or motorized and started using the internal combustion engine instead of horses to actually move the guns around the battlefield in the field artillery. But yeah, I think that really resonated with me, that there hasn't been a lot of change as to between the 1860s and 1914. And there's just another example. This guy is running the catch up. I think this is an actual howitzer gun that's actually on the move. And there you can see there's 3 teams of 2 leading it on the way. That might be an 18 pounder. I can't tell. No. I found I couldn't find it for this, but there's a great photo of an 18 pounder going through some little village in France. And there's some guy riding on the barrel. I don't know. Obviously, the safety officer wasn't watching at the time, but I wouldn't recommend that's how you travel from one gun position to the next. All right. So we talked a little bit about shrapnel shells. So this is essentially how a shrapnel shell evolved. And shrapnel was the the most plentiful of the field artillery shells that were used on the Western Front during the First World War. So Henry Shrapnel, that was his name, Henry Shrapnel, a Royal Artillery officer. Like I said, he realized that if he could cause a cannonball to burst open and spray the enemy with its bits, that was more effective than just the ball slamming into them. So he developed and patented the shrapnel shell. Then later, when it became case shot, it was similar, but it was filled with musket balls on the inside. So instead of using the body of the cannonball as the fragments or the splinters that would do the damage, it would open up. There would be a bursting charge that was only sufficient to actually open the casing of the ball, and then these little ball bearings or musket balls would come shooting out like a shotgun and spray the enemy. And then as science evolved, and you ended up with the bullet that we now know, like the elongated bullet used in rifle guns. They did the same. They would use these bursting charge to fire out the balls out of a shrapnel shell, and this is the end result of a shrapnel shell. It was about half. High explosive rounds were known, and they started to be used a lot more in 1917, and then by 1918, and then slowly after. It wasn't until I think the 1920s where they finally got rid of shrapnel shells altogether. And by the Second World War, high explosive rounds were the round of choice for the field artillery. So, but this is just, I found this just the other day. It's a great example of how a shrapnel shell functioned, and the time fuse that would be used, and the kind of the bursting charge at the back, this diaphragm that essentially got pushed forward and would push the balls out, and they would project outward, and they were the predominant anti-personnel round of the First World War. And I think we have another photo of it. That's what they looked like there. All right, and next slide. Okay, so we talked about the evolution, and so now we put it into practice. So we talked about how the artillery moved further away, and they realized that barrage, by 1917, this is the barrage map for Vimy Ridge. By this point, the use of a creeping barrage was the tactic that was used. So after the British emerged from the shell crisis of 1915, where essentially they ran out of bullets, and guns were giving rates of fire of like 2 to 3 rounds per day was all that was allowed. And the entire, I can't remember the prime minister's name, but the entire government fell on this. And it wasn't until somebody gripped British industry and they started making enough shells, because they realized weight of fire and rate of fire was absolutely key. And what was thought was going to be just at the start, as I said, direct fire, open ranges, you'll fire maybe a dozen rounds, and that was it. Now they were firing hundreds of rounds per day. And the end result was they realized, as I mentioned, that they had to suppress the enemy, not necessarily destroy him. And they came up with the rolling barrage or creeping barrage, which would essentially go in front of the assaulting infantry and suppress the enemy. So there was a layered effect, though. You have 18-pounders and 4.5-inch howitzers would be firing this kind of suppressing barrage. Meanwhile, further on, there'd be 6-inchers and 60-pounders that were firing. But also the larger guns, like the 9-inch guns and whatnot, they would be firing concentrations on, as I said, important tactical sites, whether they're headquarters or phone junctions or anything like this. So by April of 1917, using the creeping barrage was key. So essentially what you see here is the barrage map from Vimy Ridge. Each one of those squiggly lines that move, if you read it from left to right, those are the lifts. And so it lifted 100 yards every 4 minutes, I believe is what the timing was, if I remember correctly. The black lines that you see that kind of run perpendicular to those squiggly lines, those are the division markings. So from in the south, it would go first, second, third, fourth division, uh,
Okay.
and and then each divisional artillery headquarters would assign all of the brigades of the artillery a section of those lines. So those, and it doesn't figure here, but a brigade would get a certain part of that line, and they would be responsible for what was termed their lane. That was their lane of that lift. And so in their command posts, the artillery officers would calculate what the guns would have to fire on to hit that. And then each one of those lifts would be calculated beforehand. So when I talked about how monotonous it got for a gunner, and you saw that very first photo or one of the first ones we saw with the 18 pounder with all the stocked ammunition,
Yeah.
that would all be prepared, and then they would start firing at 0 hour, and then they would just fire, 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 fire for hours at a time, and the sergeant and the detachment commander would be watching his watch. He'd order a change in elevation. The elevation would change, and then they'd just keep on firing. Uh,
So,
and uh, and that's essentially the whole point was the the infantry would follow as close as possible to that. And it was called closing up or hugging the barrage. And the intent was they would be so close behind it as close as safely possible, so that when it lifted off of the German trench lines, before the Germans could readopt their firing positions, the infantry would jump in the trenches and be right on top of them. That was the science of it. In fact, the French went so far as to say that 15% of their casualties should be caused by their own barrage. That's how close they were. They were supposed to be to their barrage, also called leaning into the barrage. That's a little bit much for me, but that's how they thought it would be, and you'd be right on it. So it would lift, and the Germans would come up, and the Canadian infantry or the British infantry would be right on top of them. Just an interesting aside, in the lead up to Vimy Ridge, each division was tasked to fire 2 practice barrages, and then in order just to rehearse, and then there was one core practice barrage that was, all these were conducted before actual 0 day. But what they would do is they would fire on a German trench line, move forward a little bit, and then go back on the German trench line, ostensibly to catch the Germans when they came out of their dugouts. But what they were really doing is they were training the Germans to think that was going to happen. So the Germans said, aha. So when the fire lifted on the day, the Germans did not readopt their firing position because they thought the fire would return onto it after it lifted. But on the actual day, on Z day, when they actually launched the attack, it just kept rolling. And so the intent was to trick the Germans staying in their dugout, expecting it to come back, but instead it was Canadian infantry jumping into the trench lines. So it worked rather well. A little bit of a little deceitfulness on the part of the Canadian gunners in that regard.
it's pretty wild. If I recall right, I was watching a documentary about how the infantry would practice this. Like, and I think one of the hardest things was to keep them at a walking pace, or staying behind the barrage, and not
Mhm.
rushing ahead and getting enveloped by their own artillery.
Yeah. Exactly, and it was all about practice. And by this point in the war in 1917, uh, we had got these things down pat. So this was, I argue in my book Iron Indignation, that this is the high water mark of the phase of artillery destruction in the First World War. It didn't last long. Very shortly after, the preliminary bombardment of Vimy Ridge was 20 days long, and they fired thousands, maybe millions of shells in that time frame. But then after that, they started to use predicted fire a little bit more. They wanted to emphasize surprise a little bit more. But at this point in the war, in April 1917, it was all about just pounding the objective with artillery leading up to it.
So just make sure I'm understanding this. So prior to the battle, I guess the battery commanders, they would have this map or their section, and then the lines there was timings associated with all of these, right? And a
Exactly.
distance, and they had to follow that process to, and then
Exactly. And it's hard to see here, but in each one of those lines, there's an actual timing for when it had to be engaged.
you see David
And
here.
yeah, exactly. So in each one of the battery command posts, they would calculate that, and the guns would fire on that, and then it was. I don't know if they went quite so far as I'm assuming they did, that they would produce a gun program. What we do now is we produce a gun program, which we hand to the detachment commander, and it tells the detachment commander exactly what to fire, when to fire, what target and stuff and whatnot. He has no idea or they have no idea what they're firing at. They just have the coordinates and all the other technical information. And it's the same here, but this went on for hours. So you can imagine, kind of the monotony of the gunners, and that's all they're doing for hours at a time is just load, fire, load, fire, load, fire, load, fire, elevate, load, fire, just go on and on and on.
Well, just I've heard of the creeping barrage, but I had no idea that there was so much laborious work that went into the planning of it. And that a document like this would exist.
Mhm.
That's quite incredible.
Well, and it's because you could do, and which was done, but it was rare. Essentially, just a hasty creeping barrage where you all you do is to just kind of elevate and stuff. So you don't need to calculate. You just maybe give it a crank or so every 4 minutes. But it's not very scientific. It doesn't move with the pace of the infantry necessarily. But also, what you see here, the reason it's not just straight lines and turns and whatnot is because both the enemy trench lines influenced it and also the just the contours of the ground. And so that's why it's not just straight north-south lines that would probably have been easier to fire, but not as effective. The worst part about the barrage map is that many of these lines uh, were nowhere near the enemy, so we didn't know, or the Canadians didn't know exactly where all the enemy were located. The enemy would sometimes put machine gun nests in between trench lines, uh, but that's why they fire. So I don't even know what percentage, but a very high percentage of the rounds that were fired didn't land anywhere near a German. But it was all about suppressing anything that might be in between trench lines as it advanced.
All right. And then was it like a, a, a single veil of explosions, like not very, very thick, or was there like suppressing fire that went deeper too? And then the creeping
Yeah,
barrage kind of marked the back end of the barrage where the infantry was advancing.
yeah, it was layered. So what they would do is the front end, the closest end would be the 4.5 inch and the 18 pounders because they were the safest. I'll say that the blast area from their projectiles were the smallest, so the infantry could get the closest to it. And then a couple hundred meters and yards in front were the 6 inchers, and then so they layered it, and the whole thing moved like that. And eventually, at the same time, some of these lines, I couldn't tell you which ones, were standing barrages. So the difference between a rolling or a creeping barrage, where it kind of moves, and a standing barrage is a standing barrage. It would just land on one line, and it wouldn't move at all. So those were lined up along the German trench lines. So those were called the standing barrage. So as the creeping barrage started, other guns, more usually the larger caliber ones, were firing standing barrages in depth on the German trench lines. And then as the creeping barrage moved up and hit that trench line, they would pause there for a bit, and then it would all lift off, and they would just keep going. So by the time you got to the end of this, to the far right of the map, all the fire would have accumulated along the way up until the very end, especially in the northern parts where you see him. I keep pointing at the screen like you could see what I'm doing, but in the northern parts, the third and fourth Canadian divisions, they didn't have very far to go, so all of their artillery could reach all the way to what they call the I think it's the black line, which is the final line,
That,
or no,
that's
that's the black line. Sorry, I think the brown or maybe the blue line is the last line that you see
there's that
there.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the first and the second divisions, the two southernmost divisions that you see there, it was much further. So they actually had extra artillery assigned to them, and they were in what they called silent batteries. So not all of the 18 pounders could reach out to that final line on the far east or the far right line that you see there. So those silent batteries, they would wait, and then when it was their turn, they would just start firing and take up where the 18 pounders that were further behind had run out of range. And at that point, those 18 pounders would then limber up and be prepared to move forward, because the key thing was as soon as they took the ridge, they knew there was going to be counterattacks, so they wanted to have guns in place to fire in depth into the back, what they call again the back country, as the Germans formed up to counterattack. So yeah, it was pretty fascinating stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's there. You see a 4.5 inch howitzer. This is a famous painting called "The Taking of Vimy Ridge, Easter Sunday, 1917," by I think Richard Jack, I think, is the artist. It's pretty fascinating. But that's a 4.5 inch howitzer crew that's doing their work, and you can see he was a war artisan. So this is actually what it looked like on the day. And if you've been to Vimy Ridge, if you've had the great opportunity, it's covered in trees now, but you can see that it was just blown to shreds there. And but you can also see how exposed the guns were to observation. And not unlike what Marty was showing with his photos of the footprint that a battery took up, it was the same here. And they're hiding behind individual trees and kind of tucking themselves away where they could, and they were quite exposed. But this is just a quick snapshot of what's going on. You can kind of see the very bottom of the trail, or just 6 o'clock from the breech of that gun. You can see the projectile standing on end exactly, and what you can see, the one chap on the left handing to the other guy is a casing. So he's if I make it out correctly. So yeah, so those two would be mated and shoved into the projectile. No, sorry, into the barrel. And yeah, and that's just another gun. I think this is taken from the Somme or something like that, but just gives you an idea of the size of the guns and the hard work that was associated with it. And this is where you can see it's separate ammunition. So you see the fatigued folks over on the left, they're draped over the bullets. So those are the bullets, but you can see that the chap with the only guy with a helmet on, he's holding the actual charge. And this is where you have this is what a separate charge is. So those projectiles, you see one in the loading tray at the base of the gun. So when they open the breech, the crew will load that in there, and then this chap will put that charge behind it, close the breech, and they would usually have to add a primer that would actually cause the charge to function, and then fire the gun off.
All right. Well, that's your last slide, David. Maybe
Okay.
we'll talk about this for a quick second, and then I'll stop sharing the screen, and we can have a quick chat as we wrap up. So to the left, it's kind of an aerial view of Fort Meigs, one of my favorite historic sites in Perrysburg, Ohio. That's Marty's home fort, and where I've really gotten to know Marty quite well. Marty, do you want to add anything about Fort Meigs?
Um, it's a wonderful place. Largest wooden walled fort, slightly larger than Fort George, believe it or not.
Yeah, it's an incredible size. And we're planning for the War of 1812 Grand Tactical Memorial Day weekend, May of 2026. So come out and see us in action there. So
Yep, come play in my sandbox.
all right. And then David, you referenced your book, Iron Indignation. Here's an image of the cover right here.
Yeah, it's available. It's published by Double Dagger Books. It's available on Amazon, and in it, I discuss as the title describes, the evolution of artillery tactics from the start of the war. But I also go beforehand and talk about the introduction, the quickfire revolution, and everything that kind of led up to where the status of the artillery at the start of the war, and how it all culminated on the crest of Vimy Ridge in April 1917.
All right, and then I will add links to both in the video description. You want once I finish editing it and getting it up on screen. Fascinating talk. I've learned a lot, even around stuff I thought I knew. I had some aha moments, so that was great. Marty, what surprised you the most, or gave you the biggest aha from what David was presenting?
Oh, I was kind of sitting on my hands because I saw, I recognize that. I think I saw a ranging stake in the second to last slide, right in the center.
Yeah,
Uh,
it was sort of a striped stick. I
Striped
had
Yeah,
stick
it's
out in front of the position.
yeah.
yeah, I think they referred to it at the back then as an aiming point. We call them aiming point now, but it's because by this point, well, actually, great, fascinating point. I'm sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent here again, but I'm glad you included that Warren Venthole photo with the sighting line because with the introduction of or with the adoption of indirect fire as the main way of engaging, you can't fire over direct sights. You don't see what you're firing at, so everything is calculated trigonometrically. So the guns have to use, and you've seen in some of those images, a sight on the gun that allows them to actually align the gun in the right direction, and then just use fire off of a bearing or a azimuth of some sort. And because they can't see it, they have to just have faith that whatever they're being told to lay the gun on, the bearing and the elevation is going to hit the target.
All right, David, what was your aha moment from what Marty presented?
I had no idea that howitzers existed before the First World War or the late 19th century. So the the 5.5 inch howitzers that you showed, if I had seen that photo, I would have said it was just a mortar of some type. I had no idea that there was actual howitzers like that. So that completely baffled, didn't baffle me, but it caught me by surprise.
And I think something I long appreciated, but that barrage map really reinforced it, is artillerists, like the knowledge of math and geometry and all of that they need. Like Marty's got a really cool little thing, your brass gunner's tool, Marty, with all the
Oh
scales.
yeah, and that's English. It's basically gun. They're called calipers, but basically it's got scales on it, so you can determine the size of shot. You can turn it around so it's kind of an inside caliber, so you can measure the caliber of a gun and then determine the size of the shot from that, and then little tables of service charges and proof charges for different sizes guns, just printed right on the side of it. You can also use it as a ruler. It's got marked off as a ruler, so you can straighten it out and use it. It's a good universal little tool.
Yeah, but but it all reinforces, at least the men that led these batteries. I think they were extremely skilled and extremely knowledgeable to make all this work. So
It really reinforces with me uh, that the men who plotted those elevations that were required, that did all the calculations, they were sitting in the bottom of a dugout, by lantern, working on 1 or 2 hours sleep, constantly being shot at by the enemy, sitting over there, literally no calculators, doing everything, all the math in their head, and under very, very challenging circumstances, but they still managed to make all those calculations. It's absolutely fascinating.
all right, well, I certainly monopolized your time a ton this evening. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. That was fun for
Great.
me. So yeah.
I found it a pleasure.
All right. So I'm going to stop recording and then we'll catch everyone a little bit later.